Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Sealaska Heritage Institute, one of our noontime lectures. I'm very pleased to be able to introduce David J. Silverman, who's a professor of history at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. He's a historian specializing in American Indian and colonial American history, has written many books and monographs and articles on history of Native American tribes and their interactions with mainly with missionaries and colonial authorities in that area, particularly a book on the Brotherton and Stockbridge Indians, which you may not know those are missions in New Jersey and New York, hosting Delawares and a variety of different tribal groups were amalgamated there. The Wampanoag of Martha's Vineyard, who today are known as the Aquinnah Wampanoag from Gay Head, and Rhode Island and Connecticut tribes and Northeast colonial authorities in the 17th century. So you've got quite a span of expertise, and I'm very pleased that he's able to stop over. He was visiting the Sitka National Historical Park, and we heard about that and convinced him to stop over a day here in Juneau. Today he'll be speaking on the early contacts and interchange between the Sitka and other Tlinkits with American, British, and other traders. And I'm very look forward to hearing you talk. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me. Well, thanks for coming out in such robust numbers. Back east, when it rains, it usually means no one's coming out. Out here, I suppose people just shrug their shoulders and power on. So thanks for coming out. It's a real privilege to be hosted by Sealaska in this beautiful, beautiful building. This is an architectural marvel, and for that alone has made the visit here worth it. I just want to say, by way of prefatory remarks, that I'm acutely aware that I'm here in Tlingit country, speaking on a subject of Tlingit history, and I think it's worth noting that this is my interpretation, and my interpretation alone, of a series of significant events of the past. I don't pretend for a moment that the story that I'm telling you is the story that Tlingit people would tell to themselves and to their children. But I do invite, from those members of the audience who are Tlingit or who are not, and would like to educate me on that perspective, I certainly would welcome that feedback. And I say all of this, because I think it's important to note. I think very often the general public has a notion that history is a set of unchanging facts, and the job of the historian is just to give it to you straight. There's no such thing in historical scholarship. We argue over what the facts are, and then we argue over how to interpret the facts. And we will constantly interpret and reinterpret what that past is based on the perspectives that we bring to that material from our own time, from our own personal subjectivity. So with that, the material that I'm sharing with you today is part of a much larger book project that I've been working on for the better part of 5 or 6 years. It's winding to a close, but it's still very much a work in progress. So your feedback will be incorporated here. And this is a book that examines the various ways that indigenous people throughout North America incorporated firearms into their warfare, their hunting, their politics, and their material culture between the early 1600s and the late 1800s. And the argument that I'm planning on making in this book is that in one region after another, in one time after another, Native people concluded that firearms were the key to the intertribal balance of power. I think there's a widespread notion today, certainly among academics, to a lesser extent among the general public, a notion that appears to have emerged since the late 1960s for reasons I'll be happy to share my thoughts on with you. But I think there's this widespread notion today that bows and arrows were superior to early historic firearms, particularly to the smoothbore flintlock muskets that dominated the arms trade before the rise of rifled barrels and repeating shot technology in the 19th century. For those of you who have no idea what I just said, let me explain to you what I'm talking about. So this firing mechanism, this is the basic firing mechanism of most firearms between the early 1600s and the early 1800s. And this, with this mechanism, this is a flintlock mechanism. So when you pull the trigger, this hammer flies forward, has a piece of flint lodged within this grip, strikes the frizzen or the steel, creating a shower of sparks. That ignites a small amount of priming powder here in the pan. That combustion then passes through a small touch hole, which you can't see, into the bottom of the barrel of the weapon, igniting a larger charge and sending a lead musket ball propelling forward. The muzzle of the gun is smooth bore. It's just basically a smooth pipe. And that precedes rifles, which began to emerge on the market in around the period of the American Revolution. They really take off in Indian country on the Great Plains in the mid 19th century. A rifle has a groove inside the barrel, and that leads the bullet to come out of the gun, much like as if you threw a football with a spiral on it. It means the bullet can go farther, more accurately than with this type of smooth bore technology. This gun would have a range of about 100 yards, give or take a few. Rifle technology, you're talking upwards of 200, 300 yards plus, so there's a real difference. What I'm contending here, though, is that these flintlock, smooth-bore guns, which dominate the trade between the early 1600s and the 1800s, were in fact a superior weapon in many respects to the bow and arrow, and native people reached that conclusion. And I see that over and over again. They learned through hard experience that guns were fantastic killing tools, particularly in the context of ambush, which was the primary tactic both in warfare, and this is true across the continent. It's also the primary tactic for hunting, for that matter. Because Native people realized the incredible technological advantage that guns offered them, they used trade, diplomacy, and warfare to direct the flow of munitions to themselves and away from their enemies. I think that's an important point I want to emphasize here. Throughout this talk, as I hope you'll note, I'm emphasizing that Native people lived in multipolar political worlds. They had a complex indigenous politics that overlapped with their politics with colonial and imperial powers. You can never understand their relations, though, with colonial powers unless you ground yourself in that multipolar indigenous politics. So the pattern of trying to direct the flow of arms to themselves and away from their enemies included cultivating multiple suppliers of arms in the form of multiple colonies and empires. It also involved cultivating indigenous middlemen who very often ferried guns, powder, and shot from colonial markets to indigenous markets, sometimes very far away from the initial point of sale. I also see, and I argue in this book, that Native groups that managed temporarily to corner a regional arms market often became predatory expansionist powers, raiding poorly armed groups for captives, for slaves, for horses, for hunting territory, or what have you, depending on what resources are the source of competition, and then subjugating those groups often to the status of tributaries. And there are a number of prominent examples in the early historical record. One of them includes the Five Nations Iroquois, or Haudenosaunee, of what's now upstate New York. In the 17th century, they cornered the Dutch arms market along the Hudson River Valley and became the military power in the Northeast, overshadowing the New England colonies, the Dutch colony, and the French as well. And here you see early French drawing of Haudenosaunee warriors in the front and the back taking a captive from the Great Lakes region back to the Haudenosaunee homeland in the Finger Lakes region of what's now New York State. Another prominent example that I write about is the Blackfeet of the Rocky Mountain West and the Northern Plains. They're one of many examples from that region of Native people who combined the new technologies of the gun and the horse to become expansionist powers, belying the common assumption that Native people have colonial contact and then are in a downward trajectory from that point on. No, there are multiple examples in the historical record, I'm going to talk about some of them today, of Native people who appropriate colonial technologies like firearms, like horses, and use them to become more powerful, to become expansionist for longer or shorter periods of time. I'm also arguing in this book that well-armed Native people often became formidable rivals to colonial expansion, much to the chagrin of colonial and imperial governments. And you might be asking yourself, well, then why didn't those colonial and imperial governments just cut off the flow of arms? This is another argument I'm making, is that early modern governments at the colonial and imperial level generally proved incapable of cutting off the flow of munitions. And one of the reasons is that Native people's trade and Native people's political alliance depended on providing them with what they wanted, which was guns and powder and shot. Because this market for arms in Indian country was so robust, because Native people were largely able to acquire guns in the amounts that they wanted, guns grew to become some of the consummate tools of Indian manhood. Among many, many Native people, few adult men would be seen leaving the home community without a gun, powder, and shot in tow. Firearms also inspired vibrant artistic expression in the form of gun paraphernalia, very often made by women. This is one of the ways that Native women participated in this larger gun culture. Gun bags, bags for powder and shot were very often designed by Native women. Native men painted depictions of their martial and hunting exploits with firearms on teepees and horses, on wood panels and the like. So the big picture here then is that I see Native people across time and place in North America revolutionizing their lives through the adoption of guns. And one of those places was here in the Pacific Northwest. I contend that between the 1780s and the early 1800s, indigenous people all along the Pacific Northwest coast went from being some of the most isolated people in the world in terms of overseas trade to hosting merchant ships from half a dozen nations and participating in a global commerce linking Europe, the Americas, Polynesia, and China. Now, the shipboard merchants who came to this region did so in search of otter, and they wanted otter for the Chinese market. What Pacific Coast natives wanted in return were metal tools, cloth, and above all, guns, powder, and shot, for the same basic reasons that those items were in demand among Atlantic Coast Indians a century and a half earlier. Indians in this locale could see that foreign munitions promised to become the new key to the balance of power in a densely settled region where, with many local variations, chiefs and communities contended with one another for slaves, for tributaries, for territory, and for prestige. And the result of that competition was a vibrant gun frontier throughout the Pacific Northwest coast with a transformative power that rivaled any indigenous arms market elsewhere in the continent. One of the major sites for this trade was Nuka Sound on the west side of Vancouver Island, the site of which you see pictured here. Native leaders, like the chief of Nootka, whose communities controlled deep, sheltered ice-free harbors for merchant vessels, and which boasted wide-ranging trade and tributary networks capable of funneling otter pelts from far distant ranges, including the interior and up and down the coast, to those particular shores. Those chiefs had a means to claim a dominant position in the arms for otters traffic and in the politics of Indian country. So two such figures, who I'm going to mention in passing here, could be found among the Nuchanuth or Nootka peoples of the outer western coast of Vancouver, which was, again, one of the most intensive early sites of the trade. Those leaders included Chief McQuina of the community of Yuquat at the mouth of Nuka Sound, and another chief to his south, Wakananish of Clayoquot Sound. These two men used their favorable geography and already impressive bases of power to engross the otter for arms trade and then expand their influence until it extended over a coastal range of some 300 miles. They grew so formidable that in two separate incidents, they even managed to capture foreign merchant vessels of over 250 tons with crews of 25 or more men. I wish I had time to go into the details. Someone should make a movie about these captures. It's really striking. There's one fellow, John Jewett, who was captured in one of these attacks. He's one of only of two men spared in one of them because he's the blacksmith. And can repair these firearms and other metal tools. He was lucky to have that skill. But my focus today is not on these amazing stories. My focus today lies to the north among the Alexander Archipelago of the Alaska Panhandle, where the Tlinkits of Sitka Harbor, the Kiksadi, used British and American arms to contest the expansion of Russian fur traders into their territory. Most vividly in pitched battles in 1802 and 1804 that I think should rank among the most dramatic indigenous colonial clashes in all of North American history. I'm going to contend here that the strength of Tlingit arms placed serious limits on Russian activity and profitability. Very often, the Russians are depicted as being in control of this relationship. It's patent nonsense. The Tlinkits place serious limits on the ability of Russians to expand along the coast. Now, ultimately, and parenthetically for our purposes today, the limits on Russian expansion provided a wedge for the expansion of the British Hudson's Bay Company, and thus to the eventual absorption of coastal British Columbia into the nation of Canada. And I think that raises an important point, that no less than in the Atlantic colonies, indigenous gunmen in the Pacific Northwest influenced the pace and the geographic patterns of colonialism. So let's turn to the story. Now, it certainly won't come as any news to an Alaskan audience that the Russians were the first foreign fur traders in the region. On the East Coast, very few people are even aware that Russian colonialism was a thing in North America. I don't need to make the case to you out here. And Russian expansion into the region was an extension of their expansion across Siberia in search of fox and sable furs for the European and the Chinese markets. And this expansion into Alaska essentially begins with Vitus Bering's 1741 exploration in the Gulf of Alaska, which you see here, which not only introduced Europe to the geography of the Gulf, but also drew the attention of Russian fur traders, Promyshleniki, to the otters of the Aleutian Island chain. Those volcanic outcroppings which crest across some 1,200 miles of ocean from the Alaskan mainland towards Russia. The Chinese were willing to pay 9 times more for an otter pelt than a beaver pelt, which was the second highest ranking fur. And so there's a real profit incentive here for the Russians to exploit the otter populations that they're finding along the Aleutian Island chain. So it really only takes a decade before Russian fur traders had organized several private companies and began making their way up the islands. For those of you who are here from out of town, I realize there's so many, so we're talking about this island chain right here. Here's an example of that landscape. Well, by 1797, some 42 Russian companies had made about 101 voyages to the region. And along the way, along the path of their expansion, they followed a ruthless pattern that had served them profitably, if bloodily, with indigenous Siberians. The Promyshleniki, rather than trade for the skins or hunt for them themselves, instead raided the settlements of the native Aleuts, took the women and children hostage, and then held them until the men paid a ransom in seal, fox, walrus, and especially otter. Here are some of those men. Well, after several Allied attempts at resistance met brutal Russian suppression, this exploitation became routinized in the form of an annual tribute calculated per man, and then a labor draft was applied to every adult Allied male. And this is a pattern which is going to last for over a century and a half. So the pattern of exploitation becomes stabilized, but there's really no stability for the Aleutian population. It nearly collapsed in short order from overexploitation at Russian hands, including male casualties in the dangerous work of hunting otter from kayak in the sealskin bidarkas, which characterized their hunting. And especially the population nearly collapses from the introduction of epidemic diseases. I should mention parenthetically, there are many local iterations of native people being decimated by these diseases. Collectively, the introduction of epidemic diseases from Europe and in Africa and Asia to the Americas really should rank as the most significant disaster in modern world history. The scale of the disaster it's hard to fathom. Well, another population which suffered is the otter population, which is slow to reproduce and soon began to suffer under the strain of the hunt. Well, as otters began disappearing from the outer Aleutian Islands, the fur traders moved ever farther eastward until by 1785 they had reached Kodiak Island and then the Alaskan mainland. So it was really it was only a matter of time before they came face to face with the Tlinkits of the Panhandle. Well, Captain James Cook's voyages to the Pacific, most significantly his 1778 voyage, which you see documented here, followed by the publication of two journals from that voyage in 1783 and 84, was to the English-speaking world what Bering's voyage had been to the Russians, an announcement of a previously unknown corner of the globe teeming with otters from which riches were to be had in the Chinese market. Remember from your junior high school studies or your high school history classes, and I can hear you all saying, I hated high school history. But remember, it's the European quest for the Chinese market which drove European exploration in the Americas all the way back to the era of Columbus. And this is the coveted market for Europe for centuries. And the great dilemma for Europe is finding something to trade to the Chinese something that the Chinese want. Europe has nothing to offer to China. So Europe has to find other materials elsewhere in the world to bring to China to get the silk, the tea, the porcelain that are so coveted back in Western markets. Well, with the publication of these journals from Captain Cook's voyages, suddenly Western Europeans and Americans on the East Coast believed that they had that item that the Chinese wanted. Just a year after these journals appeared, Briton James Hanna, captaining a brig called the Hammond, managed to acquire 560 otter pelts after just 5 weeks, anchored in Nuka Sound at this location right here. He then sold those 560 otters for 20,000 Spanish dollars in Canton, China. 20,000 Spanish dollars. Now keep in mind, this is the late 18th century. By 1792, upon news, by the way, he renamed his ship the Sea Otter. I think that tells you all you need to know. By 1792, there were 22 vessels off the Pacific Northwest coast. Half of them British, 6 of them American, mostly from Boston. Natives on this coast called all Americans Bostonians or Boston men. Other ships flew the flags of Spain, Portugal, or French, but most of them were captained by Britons. These are British merchants who were trying to get around various British imperial regulations by flying foreign flags. Well, from that time forward, the majority of craft in this region were out of the United States. Again, mostly Boston. British shipping was dramatically disrupted by the Napoleonic Wars, as you can imagine. What's more, New England merchants were desperate to find new entrepreneurial ventures because the U.S. victory in the American Revolution shut out New England merchants from the lucrative British Caribbean trade. When they had been part of the British Empire, they could participate in that trade. They declared independence and lost it, which meant that they really shot themselves in the foot economically. So New England merchants are looking outward for some means to turn a profit. So by 1801, American ships outnumbered British ships in this region by a ratio of 22 to 2. Well, with crews of 20 to 25 men and the ships often weighing 250 tons or more, the costs of doing business were high. And there were high risks involved of this too. The risk of losing one ship to a storm, to an accident, to an indigenous community. But the investments were commonly bringing returns of 300 to 500%. So these prospective profits were too lucrative to resist. Guns like the one you see here, again, this is a smooth bore flintlock. Guns, powder, and shot very quickly moved to the head of indigenous peoples' list of the most desirable trade goods. And let me emphasize here, only the best quality weapons would do. And this is a pattern that I see extending all the way back to the earliest trade in arms from the 17th century. Many of my scholarly peers, many people that I've talked to in the general public, assume that fur traders are dumping low-quality munitions on Native people who don't know any better. It's patently untrue. What I'm finding, actually, is that Native people are routinely getting not only high-quality arms, but sometimes cutting-edge technology, and insisting upon it, or they'll take their business elsewhere. They have a tremendous amount of leverage in these commercial relationships because there are so many different fur traders competing for their business. Let me give you a couple examples of what I'm talking about. So after working the Pacific Northwest coast for several years in the early phase of the trade, a Bostonian named Sullivan Dorr advised his brother back home that the cunning savages, as he called them, he said, they are great merchant traders, and they will accept only, and I quote again, good trade powder muskets. Again, at the end of his letter, he said, send only good trade powder muskets. Send me junk, I can't do my business. Native people knew exactly what they meant by that term. Boston merchant William Sturgis wrote of Native men subjecting his trade guns, and I quote here, to a very thorough examination, often even taking the lock to pieces to look at every screw. In other words, they're taking apart the gun and then putting it back together before they'll agree to buy it. Well, with these kinds of discerning customers, most firms stocked better trade guns for Native people than for the protection of their crews. In 1802, a German naturalist who visited the coast was surprised to find, and I quote, that one can now buy the best English arms on this part of the northwest coast of America, more cheaply than in England. Now, fortunately for the merchants, the relatively low cost of Indian trade goods and the high price of furs in China more than offset the inconvenience of pleasing these fickle customers. In 1799, Boston merchant Thomas Lamb filled the inventory for his ship, called the Alert, by purchasing muskets in bundles of 50, costing over $416, or just over $8 a gun. He then traded these guns along the northwest coast for 6 otter skins apiece, when those pelts were selling in Canton for $20 each. So again, each gun is about $8 when you buy it wholesale. He's getting 6 otter skins apiece, and those otter skins are collectively worth $120. All right, that's a steep profit margin. And here, of course, is the region we're talking about. Even selling at the price of just 1 otter skin per gun, as was the rate a few years later because of competition, even that was likely to bring a slim return. And it's not only the cost of the gun versus the price that one can receive for the pelt in Canton. For one, owning a musket was a lot like owning a Xerox copier a long time ago. It wasn't the machine that the company wanted to sell you. It was all the ink and the cartridges. They knew you'd be buying materials for many years. Well, owning a musket required the owner to purchase powder, shot, flints, gun worms, which is a corkscrew-shaped tool to clean the barrel, and those all carried steep profit margins. What's more, the sale of other high-yield goods, blankets, clothing, pots, axes, mirrors, tobacco also depended on the sale of arms, because most indigenous people were only willing to do business for those other goods with merchants who first satisfied their desire for the weapons. And here, by the way, is an early Russian drawing of a Tlingit man holding one of these muskets. I was told by a Tlingit audience member in Sitka that he's not wearing Tlingit garb, even though he's a Tlingit man. Again, one of those benefits of having indigenous audience members. So again, you know, the upfront costs of this kind of traffic were great. American exports to the Northwest coast climbed in value from $10,000 in 1790 to reach a 10-year high of some $750,000 in the year 1800. But the returns were just enormous. Ships that worked the Northwest coast for a year or two often came home with profits of $200,000 per ship. So again, if one had capital to invest, there were fortunes to be made in the Pacific Northwest. So let's turn to this local story. So the Sitka Tlingits, or Kiksadi, followed a similar trajectory to their Nuchanuth neighbors to the south in terms of quickly accumulating wealth and power through the exchange of otter for arms, followed by a series of dramatic gun battles with Europeans and then the collapse of the trade. But I think the differences in their stories are also quite instructive about the differences between their social structures and the colonial contexts in which they operated. The Tlingits were quite different from the native people of Vancouver Island in that they didn't follow single leaders akin to the great chiefs and sub-chiefs at the center of Nuchanuth society. Rather, Tlingit communities were made up of distinct self-governing clans in which the leadership was also decentralized. So you don't see in Tlingit country single chiefs engrossing the trade and then using that trade to expand their power. What we see is that the focus of the trade in Tlingit country focused on group interests and group rivalries, not personal interests and personal rivalries. Now, that dynamic made coordinated action difficult among the various Tlingit communities, but it also made coordinated action quite forceful once a consensus had been reached. Another critical distinction between what one sees in the Alaskan Panhandle between what's happening farther south in Vancouver is that the Tlingits are buying arms from British and American vessels, not just to use against other indigenous people, but against the Russians who are encroaching on their territory. That's a problem that native people in Vancouver didn't have to face, not yet. The result, I think, is some of the most stunning examples of indigenous military resistance to European colonialism in the history of North America. So let's turn to that. So after furtive commercial contacts with Britons, Americans, Spaniards, and the French during the 1780s, the Tlingits began to occupy a greater role in the otter trade in the 1790s, just as the position of indigenous people in Nuka Sound was slipping. And this is particularly true of the Tlingits of Sitka, or the Kiksadi. Here's a later illustration of Sitka Harbor. Sitka not only boasted a deep, sheltered ice-free harbor, but some of the richest otter hunting territory in the region. And the Kiksadi not only obtained otter from their own hunts, but they also obtained pelts from northern Athapaskans, Haidas, Tsimshians, and other inner coast groups occupying areas that couldn't be reached by ship. So in other words, they're drawing on an extensive, long-standing indigenous trade network throughout the region to funnel otter pelts to their particular harbor. Again, this is an old network that, alongside the otter trade, trafficked shells, blankets, pigments, leather armor, canoes, and slaves up and down the Panhandle and between the coast and interior areas. In this version, however, what the Kiksadi could offer in return for those items were munitions, in addition to their traditional wares. Now, the Sitka Tlingit, the Kiksadi, were unequivocal, one merchant wrote, and I quote, that muskets and powder was their first demand. A ship anchored at Sitka with munitions to sell could net as many as 800 otter pelts in 4 days. And given those returns, the fur traders just pounced on the opportunity. It was only a decade before some observers judged that the Tlinkits, and I quote, former instruments of war, such as spears and arrows, are almost wholly out of use. They also commented that they saw many Tlinkits hunting otter with guns. I doubt the bow and arrow and spears and harpoons were out of use, but I think the point is made that guns are really becoming incorporated into Tlingit hunting. Well, given how well armed the Tlinkits had become in such a short period of time, suffice it to say, it was an inopportune time for the Russians to begin expanding their fur enterprise south into Tlingit territory. Now, the Russians, just to recap, turned towards the Panhandle after they had decimated the otter population in the Aleutian Islands and Kodiak Island. What's more, the Tsarist government in 1799 took the various competing Russian fur companies and incorporated a single company, the Russian-American Company, and gave it a monopoly on all of Russia's American ambitions. The problem for the Russian-American Company, though, or the RAC, was that the Tlinkits weren't as easily dominated as the Aleuts or the Aletites had been. Here's an early Russian drawing of a prominent Tlingit leader in the Sitka region. For one, the Kiksadi and the Tlinkits more generally were more numerous and densely settled than those northern peoples, and they had the access to the resources of a vast continental interior. And again, equally important, they're at least as well armed as the Russians, and often better so. In 1799, a Russian-American company official witnessed 5 British ships trading in the vicinity of Sitka, much to the outrage of the governor of the RAC, Alexander Baranoff, whose job it was to assert the company's claims to the area. On February 15th, 1799, he complained that a Boston ship had bartered for some 2,000 sea otters right in front of the Russians, with no apparent concern whatsoever for this supposed breach of jurisdiction. Apparently, the going rate was a single pelt for a gun, along with 3 or 4 pounds of powder and 6 to 8 pounds of lead shot. The shipboard merchants, Baranoff said, you could see him clenching his fists and gritting his teeth. They even traded artillery to the Tlinkits. Cannon, small cannon. A stunned Baranoff reported, I myself saw in neighboring villages 4 cannons of 1-pound caliber. These are small guns, but cannons nevertheless. And I have heard that in other villages they have more of them, of heavier caliber. He called the Bostonians the most, and I quote, shameless of all these gun runners, utterly indifferent to how they were putting everyone, he said, in danger, by which he meant the Russians. Now, on its very face, the RAC's plan to build at Sitka was an affront to the Kiksadi. I've often heard people refer to the Russian post there as a trade post. It's not a trade post. The purpose is not to trade with local people. This is an advanced station of what amounts to an invasion. The Russians weren't going to trade with the Kiksadi for furs, but rather they brought with them Aleut and Aletic, basically serfs, to go hunt the region for them. In other words, they're encroaching on otter hunting territory that the Kiksadi need to engage in their own arms trade. Here, by the way, is one of the early drawing of one of the native people who hunted for the Russians. Well, indifferent to the risk, in 1799, the RAC began building a palisaded fort at a location 7 miles north of modern-day Sitka Village. And tensions mounted immediately. This is the site of later Sitka, where Sitka Village is located today. Within a year, the RAC was receiving 3/4 of its annual otter pelt returns from Sitka Sound, with yields of 2,000 pelts in the summer of 1800 and as many as 4,000 pelts in the summer of 1801. All along, the Russians refused to trade with their hosts, the Kiksadi, for armaments. Worse yet, Kiksadi traditions tell of the Russians, Aleuts, and Alatik committing murders, rapes, kidnappings, imprisonments, grave desecrations, and an abominable joke in which they fled a Tlingit visitor human flesh. There's no mistaking the Tlingits' resentment in all of this. In the spring of 1800, a band of Kiksadi beat and robbed the Russians' interpreter, and when the Russians sent out 22 armed men to return the insult, they suddenly found themselves surrounded by 300 or more Kiksadi warriors armed with guns. Now, a crisis was averted here when a clear-headed Russian managed to fire a cannon, and then the Kiksadi war party scattered. But a warning had been sent, if not necessarily received. From this point on, the Kiksadi are determined to creating a regional alliance to offset this Russian expansion. And one of the ways they formed this alliance throughout the area shown on this map was to take arms from various points at which they had been accumulated in Tlingit and Haida country, and then to redistribute them throughout the various members of the alliance. Again, these are independent communities, right? They're not under the leadership of any particular chief. And so exchanging arms, redistributing arms between communities is truly a sign of goodwill. Now, native informants under interrogation would later tell the Russians that a plot had been months in the making, drawing together people from throughout Tlingit and Haida communities across 4,000 square miles of the Alexander Archipelago and beyond. For instance, the Sitka Tlingit of Wrangel Island, as well as an unnamed indigenous leader from Prince of Wales Island, were said to have, and I quote from the Russian documents, to have provided much powder, lead, and other weapons, and delivered several large cannons, distributing munitions to each of the Toyans, or community leaders. The Tlingits of Angalong, a short distance west of Sitka, received military stores from as far away as the Haidas of Dahl Island, which had recently become one of the most trafficked areas of the Otter for arms trade. These anecdotes suggest to me that a bird's eye view of the Alaskan Panhandle during the months of preparation in which Native people were getting ready to resist the Russians would have witnessed dotted black lines of canoes with shipments of arms busily crossing this way and that, like the pods of whales that descended on the Sitkan coast every spring. Well, the clan leaders, according to Tlingit informants, waited until the very last minute to tell the young people just what these measures were for. They didn't want the young people to reveal the plot. And by the time they were done, they had built a solid front, an alliance among otherwise independent communities, and strategically they ensured that the Russians would never be able to wipe out their armaments in one fell swoop. They were distributed among too many places along the coast. Well, the militants' coordination was as effective in execution as it was impressive in scope. The first strike, on May 22, 1802, targeted a hunting party of 450 baidarkas, or kayaks, under the leadership of Ivan Kuskov at a place called Akoi, or Akwe, near Yakutat, 235 miles north of Sitka. There, the Tlingits used a small raid to draw Kuskov's party into ambush, and then, according to Russian sources, opened a heavy fire, and I'm quoting here, a heavy fire from a great number of guns and musketoons, or blunderbusses. These are very big shoulder arms, which killed one, wounded four, and ultimately drove the survivors back to Yakutat. Kuskov was surprised to find that the Tlingits had, and I quote, plenty of firearms and ammunition. He judged their munitions to be double the amount he had witnessed among them the previous summer, doubtlessly a product of this redistribution of munitions that I was talking about earlier. Now, the largest and most tactically important Tlingit attacks took place in and around Sitka. This is a modern artist's rendering of what that attack might have looked like. By the spring of 1802, the Russian redoubt, St. Michael's, was still under construction, but it already boasted a two-story barracks, 2 blockhouses, and a surrounding wall or palisade. For most of the early spring, its population stood at about 29 Russian men, 200 Aleut men, and a number of their indigenous wives. But then in May, and this was the opportunity, its manpower fell sharply. 90 Baidarkas, some carrying 2 paddlers at a time, left suddenly for a hunt in Frederick Sound. So this is the opportunity for which the Kiksadi had been waiting. At the site of Cake on Kupreanof Island, Tlingit gunmen sprung an ambush on the hunting party in which they killed all but 24 of the men and seized some 1,300 otter pelts, which they then used for the purchase of more munitions from the British and the American ships. Meanwhile, on June 15th, as many as 1,000 Tlingit warriors used a pincer movement, so they're moving in 2 different directions, to strike at the Russians at the redoubt of St. Michael's at Sitka, with one side rushing on the fort from the wood's edge and another making an amphibious landing by canoe. After silently taking up positions around the palisade, the warriors, according to one survivor, and I quote, opened strong gunfire through our portholes, all the while keeping up that horrible roar and noise, imitating the clan animals whose masks they were wearing. These military helmets and armor, they're designed to instill terror, and it worked, for sure. The attackers utterly overwhelmed the 16 armed defenders, killing most of them in short order and taking the rest into captivity. The visitors then finished the assault by looting an estimated 3,700 otter pelts and then putting the structure to the torch. So between the attack at Cake and the attack at Sitka, the Tlingits had killed nearly 200 of the enemy. Now there's this pattern you see in colonial American history in which colonial and imperial powers never believe that Native people are attacking because of legitimate grievances. They never believe that there's actual politics involved in these attacks. What they always charge is that some rival imperial power is pulling the strings. Like a puppet master getting their indigenous puppets to dance. And the Russians believe that is the case here. They contended that the American and British traders had basically convinced local Tlingits to attack the Russian post in order to seize the pelts to then sell for their own profit. Governor Baranov of the Russian-American Company is one such figure. The truth of the matter, though, is that the Tlingits hardly needed encouragement from these foreign merchants, given the depth of their grievances against the Russians. Now, it took almost 2 years for Baranov to organize a counterstrike, during which the Tlingits were preparing by stockpiling munitions and strengthening their defenses. This is a Russian illustration, doubtlessly an oversimplified one, of the fort the Tlingits had made during that 2-year interval at the site of Sitka. This particular fort, it's on the site of the National Park at Sitka. I'm sure some of you have visited that place. This fort contained a palisade constructed of spruce logs about 2 arms length around, according to one account, 10 feet high, and 245 feet long on the side facing the water. Keep in mind, this palisade is being erected without the benefit of draft animals, without the benefit of the wheel. So this is a major effort in manpower and coordination. Stacked mast timbers, stacked horizontally, reinforced the base of this wall inside and out. So you have timbers going up, and then you have timbers laid horizontally. And that enabled the Tlingits to position the palisade logs at a 70-degree angle sloping inward. Why? So that cannonballs would roll off towards the outside of the fort. So they hit the wall and then roll off. Mounted atop the walls of this fort were 2 cannons, either captured from the Russian redoubt 2 years earlier or traded for by from the British and American merchant. And inside were more than 100 cannonballs. So this is a formidable structure, suffice it to say. Well, the Tlingits would need it because they faced an invading force of 6 ships, 400 Baidarkas, and as many as 1,000 Russian and native men. This is a modern artist's rendering of what this scene might have looked like. Now, the Russian demands to avert this attack were for the Tlinkits to surrender the fort, release any remaining prisoners, and concede to the RAC building a post at the site. But the Tlinkits wouldn't budge unless the Russians also gave hostages, and negotiations quickly gave way to battle. Unfortunately for the Tlinkits, they suffered a devastating blow even before the battle had begun in earnest. They had stored a large quantity of ammunition on one of the harbor islands, and on September 29th, as a canoe of young men returned from a mission to go fetch that gunpowder, a Russian longboat opened fire on it, igniting the store of powder and blowing the canoe and most of the paddlers sky high. A couple survived, and when I quoted from Tlingit informants, two of those men are the informants for the Russians. This loss then left the people in the fort with a severe shortage of ammunition. Nevertheless, the power of Tlingit guns almost drove the Russians to abandon this campaign. On October 1st, a Russian and Aleut force tried to storm the fort with 150 men and four cannon, only to be met by what they called an awesome fire, directed, and I quote again, with an order and execution that surprised us. Captain Yuri Lizansky remembered, in a very short while, every one of us was wounded, and 10 lay dead. Well, so the Russians then began retreating, at which point the Tlinkits poured out of the fort, and this is a scene captured here by a modern artist. They poured out of the fort for hand-to-hand combat with their war captain, Katlian, leading the charge, formidably dressed in his clan's raven helmet and wielding a heavy blacksmith hammer that had been captured from the first Russian killed at the attack of 1802. The only thing that saved the Russians and Aleuts in retreat from getting completely routed was that soldiers on the ships opened fire with their big guns, sending shrapnel all over the hill, thereby leading the Tlinkits to withdraw back within the protection of their walls. Well, the Tlinkits tried to answer by bombarding the Russian vessels with their own artillery, but they inflicted only minor damage to some rigging. The ships were just anchored too far away. So all of a sudden, the Tlinkits faced the prospect of a long siege. And here, as a historian, I reached the limits of my evidentiary base to be able to determine what they were thinking. I have no way of knowing from the historical record, the archaeological record, or anything that I've encountered in recorded Tlingit traditions of whether the Tlinkits were accustomed to experiencing long sieges. Sieges of days and weeks, or even months. I have no way of knowing that. I know from other parts of native North America that those kinds of sieges were very, very rare in indigenous warfare. Generally speaking, the kinds of casualties that a community would have to absorb to withstand a siege were just anathema to native ways of warfare. You didn't sacrifice large portions of a civilian population in order to hold a particular piece of ground. Rather than dig in, what the Tlinkits did is they delayed. They sent for reinforcements to the nearby community of Angoon on Admiralty Island, and then tried to buy time by raising a white flag and handing over 9 people as hostages. Even then, though, and I love this, the Russians had to keep up their artillery fire because Tlinkits kept running out of the fort to collect cannonballs that were on the shore. And I suspect that these are cannonballs that had rolled off the wall. It's almost Monty Python-esque because if they're going to take Russian cannonballs and then fire back at the Russian, and no one's laughing on the ground during this episode. From our distance, it's pretty amusing. But regardless, what we have is this delaying tactic, and you have Russian ultimatums and Sitkan promises to surrender going back and forth between the ships and the fort for several days until the morning light of October 7th, when the Russians awoke to find the fort completely deserted, with the inhabitants having decamped in the middle of the night for Point Craven on the opposite side of the island. If only they had boasted enough ammunition, I have no doubt that the Kiksadi could have held out far longer. When the Russians entered the fort, they found it almost completely undamaged. They found it well stocked with artillery guns and cannon shot, And so they judged, and I quote, that the chief cause of the Kiksadi flight was the want of powder and ball, and that if these had not failed them, they would have defended themselves to the last extremity. And intelligence from Tlingit sources and later Tlingit oral histories have reached the exact same conclusion. It's a lack of ammunition that leads to them abandoning the fort. Now, even though a Kiksadi leader named Colonial, pictured here, eventually visited the new Russian fort at Sitka, built after this battle, New Archangel, to perform ceremonies of peace, the level of consensus behind him appears to have been shallow. Everywhere else, the Tlingits appeared to be bracing for this war to continue. And this is one of the interventions I want to make here, is that too often this battle is treated as the sum of the war. It's one battle in a much larger campaign. And the Tlingit seem to think that this is going to continue. At Point Craven, the Kiksadi had constructed a double palisaded stronghold on top of a steep rock several hundred feet above the water. Some foreign visitors who went to the site, I don't know what they were thinking. This is a German and American naturalist who visit the Russian fort, and then they hike across Baranof Island to the Tlingit fort at this particular moment. But they go to the site, and they reported that the people were very well armed and edgy. They even saw Tlingit women bearing firearms, which tells you something. Intelligence from other parts of Tlingit territory carried news of the people stockpiling weapons and readying their forts, and not just for defensive purposes. Less than a month after Baranof thought a peace had been reached, a party of Tlingit warriors sacked a Russian fort at Yakutat, killing between 12 and 20 Russians and Aleuts, capturing others, and permanently wiping out this post, which had been a thorn in their side for years. Ongoing Tlingit hostility made Russian activity beyond the fort at Sitka perilous, and sometimes this hostility took place right alongside the walls of the fort. In 1806, just a year after peace negotiations, one RAC officer admitted, "In truth, our fort is more like an island, because any activity beyond the walls required an armed guard." Small groups of Tlingits occasionally visited the fort, but it seemed that they were on scouting missions to check out the defenses. In the winter of 1806 and 1807, a large-scale Tlingit attack on New Archangel seemed imminent. Hundreds of canoes, carrying thousands of warriors from at least 5 different communities, appeared in Sitka Harbor, and the men took positions on islands all around the fort. It took desperate Russian diplomacy marked by uncommonly generous gift-giving, something the Russians were always reluctant to do, to break this coalition and avert a disaster. Nevertheless, Tlingit hostility towards Russian Aleut hunting parties remained a constant danger. In 1818, for instance, Tlingit gunmen killed 23 and wounded 18 hunters off Prince of Wales Island, and there was little the Russians could do. "The local people have more firearms than we," one Russian official complained as late as 1818. A Tlingit fort near Sitka was so bold as to present 10 mounted cannon to Russian visitors. And all this, charged one Russian captain, "I can state without hesitation, was by means of gunpowder and bullets supplied by the enlightened Americans." Now, overhunting and the devastation of epidemic disease meant that the ascendancy of the Nuchanuth of Nuka Island and the Kiksadi of Sitka Harbor on the back of the Otter for Guns trade couldn't be sustained. Indeed, the collapse of the gun frontier all along the Pacific coast was almost as sudden as its rise. The coastal otter population was buckling in the early 1800s under the stress of overhunting. By the 1830s, it had essentially collapsed. These numbers speak to the point. American shipments of otter to Canton dropped from 18,000 pelts in 1800 to 4,300 pelts in 1815 to 500 in 1828. Shipboard merchants did everything they could to make up the difference. They extended their voyages to as many as 3 years. They diversified their trade. They began ferrying goods between indigenous communities from Washington State in the south all the way up to the Aleutian Islands, including, I should note, indigenous slaves. So these are Bostonians whose region is in the middle of an abolitionist movement ferrying indigenous slaves along the Pacific Northwest coast. Other merchants partnered with the Russians to carry the Bidarka hunters south to California, leading to the establishment of the fort of Fort Ross, just north of modern-day San Francisco. But the trade was dying, and everyone knew it. As a result, by the 1830s, the shipboard merchants had shifted their focus from otter to beaver, and their geography from the outer coast of the Alaska Panhandle to the inner coast and the interior river valleys. This was the wedge, this shift from otter to beaver, for America's preeminent fur trading firm, the Hudson's Bay Company, to inaugurate its expansion along the coast. So anchored by the fur trading transshipment center of Fort Vancouver on the Columbia River, and more than a century of experience operating in the remote Canadian interior, the HBC soon had a network of posts throughout the region. Fort Langley near the modern city of Vancouver, Fort Simpson at the mouth of the Nass River, Fort McLaughlin on Millbank Sound, and other places. In the short term, this HBC expansion is a boon for Native people controlling the river mouths to the interior, like the Stickeen and Chilkat Tlinkits and Tsimshians. For the outer coast otter hunters, it's another sign of their collapsing economic and military power. What one sees is that the outer coast populations, which had earlier used their advantage in arms to intimidate interior peoples, suddenly find themselves on the receiving end of that relationship, as they are less well-armed than peoples on the inner coast and the interior river valleys. According to one Russian account, the warfare that ensued from this expansion of the beaver trade to the inner coast and river valleys led to thousands of native deaths, particularly among outer coast populations. What's more, the outer coast population suffered from epidemic diseases introduced by ships that increasingly visited their shores only to trade for provisions and then to sail off and arm their enemies. Already, by 1803, the Nootka population had dropped from an estimated 3,000 to 4,000 people to as few as 1,500 in 1803. And the trend continued. The Tlinkits were hit hard too, in Sitka and elsewhere, suffering the deaths of some 6,000 people out of an overall population of 10,000 during a single smallpox epidemic in 1635 to 37. The Kiksadi alone lost 300 to 400 people in that scourge. So I'll conclude by noting this. Just like the tides and the winds that lash so much of the Pacific Northwest coast, building up and then eroding the land in cycles, the gun frontier had a way of elevating indigenous people, then to pummel them in the end. And certainly, one reason is that groups that had an advantage in arms undertook predatory raiding to subject others to tributary or slave status and claim valor for their warriors, only to receive the same treatment in return once the locus of the gun trade shifted to a new area. Not to be overlooked is the role of an international capitalist market, which linked the Pacific Northwest coast to arms and ammunition manufacturers in Europe, to oceanic middlemen from Boston and Britain, to fur customers in China, and then consumers of Chinese wares in the American Northeast. These markets, which would consume as many furs as Native people produced and would produce as many arms and as much ammunition as Native people would buy, enticed Northwest Coast natives to kill off the otter, just as Eastern Native people had overexploited the beaver and put themselves out of business more than a century earlier. The unwillingness of indigenous communities to see political rivals claim the lion's share of this trade and gain the political and military rewards created an arms race that ultimately became a race to the bottom, as the people exhausted their natural resources and turned the weapons against each other. Foreign epidemic diseases, the fellow travelers of munitions on the ships of the gun runners, were more than just insult to injury, though they were insulting just the same. Collectively, I see them all as a piece in the destructive cycles of colonialism in Indian country. Thanks. So comments, questions, criticism, please. Yes, sir.
Was there any gun trade from the Spanish settlements in Southern California north along the coast?
So the Spanish are the one imperial power that doesn't really serve as a major source of firearms into native North America, with one major exception. And I should note, the Spanish have a very difficult time supplying their own colonists in North America. California, New Mexico, Texas are woefully undersupplied. And that goes double for native people who trade with the Spanish.
So not dissimilar to the Russian situation?
It's not very dissimilar to the Russian situation at all. The only place where the Spanish serve as a major source of firearms is in Florida, where they contract out with a British firm, which then supplies the Creeks and the Choctaws in the southeast. Yes, sir.
Can you comment on Russian versus other trade with China? I thought that the Russians, at least for some substantial period, could only trade inland.
That's exactly right.
And so then that, apart from other things, that put them at a serious economic disadvantage.
That's exactly right. So, the Russians have a jump in terms of time on the British and the Americans with the Chinese trade, and they're doing this as early as the 18th century. But they were operating at a disadvantage in terms of where they're allowed to trade. The Chinese government was centralized and placed very strict very tight restrictions on foreigners trading within the empire. And they would stipulate you can only trade at such and such a port, and you can't travel beyond the walls of the merchant traders to interact with the local civilian population. Britons and Americans could trade at Canton, which was a much more lucrative site of trade than the inland community where the Russians unloaded their otter. So yes, they're operating at a disadvantage there for sure. Yes?
Yes, when you refer to Sitka, you talk about the Kiksari.
Yes.
And you don't reference the Kagwantan or the Pakwakari. Was the period of time you're talking about prior to their coming down from Friday and Yakutat?
I don't have that kind of detailed information. With the ways the Russians refer to the local native, they don't even call them Tlingit, they don't call them Kiksadi, they call them Kalash, right? Which is, as I understand, a Russian derivation of an Aleutian term referring to the Labrets. So doubtlessly, right, clan affiliation plays a major factor in the politics that I'm talking about here. The problem is that as a historian, I don't have the privilege of that information. Indigenous people might have more to say about that. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
My mother used to tell me that the Russians had a blockade between the Tlingits and the Russians, and they would open and let them on their side. So the people, the Tlingits in Sitka, found bigger ways to irritate the Russians.
There's no question, and I think that speaks to a broader point that even though the battles of 1802 and 1804 are the most dramatic examples of the hostility in that relationship, it's hard to say when this war ends, right? It's in some ways it's ongoing as long as the Russians are in the neighborhood infringing on Tlingit rights.
I think what you have to say is that in Sitka and elsewhere, the Tlingit never really gave up their control
Yep,
of the area
that's right.
outside. The Russians, even until 1867, were fearful to go outside the fort.
That's right.
Their documents talking about that all the way through that time period.
There would have been Russian posts up and down the coast to a far greater extent than they were it not for that, for the Tlingits continuing to defend their territory. Yeah, no doubt. Yes, ma'am.
The Russians had to leave because of the Tlingit sale, and it was the Crimean War that brought the Russians home. They reached a point of diminishing returns.
Right.
The economy broke down, and so the Crimean War allowed them to make the sale and and they left. And so I refer to it as the Russian occupation of Tlingit lands.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Yes, ma'am.
I just wanted to, first of all, answer the question that very definitely the Kagwantan were in Sitka, along with the Sukmakadi. But I wanted to add a little bit about the women, because women did play a part in that 1804 war. And I think there are a couple of different translations of that war. And the women actually, they played an important part in the war. And there's a really great account. I've always wanted to produce a movie about it, where the women are lined up with big box drums, and they start wailing. They are hitting those big box drums, and I don't know if you guys have heard the box drums, how loud it is. But if you could hear, a string of them in a row, and the women are pounding on those things and hollering. And then there are accounts about the Russians, coming up, and they've got the Aleuts in front of them. They're holding them like shields for them. And then, of course, you will see, you could go downstairs and see some of the women wear helmets. And if I had thought about it, we would have brought out, one of the, what do you call those bombs, those muskets, or those that we have from Sitka. And we have one of them from Sitka. Yeah, cannon.
Oh,
we have
yeah.
a cannon from Sitka, and we also have, I think, a rifle, don't we? One of the older
That's on
rifles.
exhibit, the
Yeah,
spear
is it-
made
yeah.
out of a rifle barrel.
Yeah.
Yeah. But very definitely,
Sitka.
women did play a part in warfare. And I know that today there is some, discussion that women didn't play a role, but in fact, the history, the oral accounts, there's physical hard evidence that shows that they were a significant part. My own name, and I always try to remind my chair over there, chair of the Sealaska Board of Directors, that my name is Kahani, and it means woman who stands in the place of a man. And it comes from Asamachopat, and we would go into the interior and trade, and my name comes from a rifle, and we would hold up a rifle. And this is not, this is not just storytelling, it's the truth. We'd hold up the rifle, and we'd make our interior relatives trade, and they'd have to line up, they have to pile up the fur until the height of the rifle. Then we would give them the rifle and take the fur.
Yeah, there are a number of these coastal merchants who are struck by the heavy involvement of women along the Pacific Northwest coast in the trade, which is something you don't see in a lot of other Native communities in the lower 48. But there's no question about it. They're on the ships, like very often involved in the gun trade, inspecting the guns alongside the men and having a very vocal say in what's to be traded and in what amounts. Yeah, I suspect that's right. Yeah.
More questions? I think, I'll just make a statement. I think that you might want to qualify some of your conclusions regarding the kind of dominance of the outside people with more guns over their interior, over the inside coastal peoples. I'm not sure that was true in Alaska. And the other part of that is another example of, you were talking about the northern expansion of the Hudson Bay Company, but in Sitka, there was a different history there of Hudson Bay showing up there and the Tlingits not letting them establish posts there and making them go up to the Canadian, inside the Canadian border to do that. And then they went to the Russians in Sitka and asked them to come and establish a trading post there. Oh, and the Russians, of course, were happy to do that to keep the Hudson Bay Company out of that area.
Well, thank you all for your attention and comments.